Hello, my name is Egon Cholakian. Today I will present evidence that the Russian government is fully aware of the danger posed by the Siberian magma plume. Furthermore, I will reveal the course of action they have chosen in response. Let me remind you that the Siberian magma plume is an upwelling stream of hot magma rising from the Earth's core to the boundary of the Earth's crust beneath Siberia. The eruption of this plume, comparable in size to the entire continent of Australia, would be catastrophic not only for Russia, but could also trigger a chain reaction of supervolcano eruptions worldwide, ultimately rendering the planet uninhabitable. In my previous videos, I have presented a number of indisputable facts pointing to the activation of this plume, facts that can be easily verified even through Russian sources. For years, I, along with a watch of volunteers, have worked tirelessly to raise awareness about the threat of the Siberian plume. Moreover, we have repeatedly outlined the steps necessary to address this danger and protect human lives. I personally reached out to all Russians, including my Russian colleagues in the scientific community and the President of Russia. I held on to the hope that science, common sense, and human decency would prevail over political maneuvering. Today, I will share how the Russian government has decided to wield this truth about the Siberian magma plume. Let's start from the very beginning. Many of you are likely aware that in 2021, Mr. Shoigu, who at that time was still Russia's Minister of Defense, unveiled an ambitious program for the development of Siberia. The core focus of this initiative was on constructing modern cities with populations exceeding 1 million people, centered around major industrial enterprises, scientific hubs, high-tech manufacturing facilities, and universities. There was extensive discussion about the significant scientific, industrial, and transportation potential of Siberia. This, of course, comes as no surprise. Allow me to remind you that Siberia holds an immense share of Russia's natural wealth. Approximately 80% of Russia's coal reserves, 37% of its gold deposits, 97% of its platinum group metals, and numerous other valuable resources. Siberia not only accounts for the majority of Russia's production of precious metals, from nickel and copper to gold and silver, but also contains 20% of the planet's freshwater reserves. Clearly, the large-scale development of Siberia was a strategically essential step to securing Russia's long-term economic growth. Here I want to emphasize a critical detail. This program was in development for over 10 years with the involvement of leading experts. It was heavily promoted, presented to the Russian president, and ultimately received his endorsement. However, in January 2023, the Russian government made an unexpected and, one might say, shocking move by approving a new development strategy. You'll find the core conclusion of this strategy quite interesting. The Russian government no longer sees Siberia as a region with development prospects. Instead, it has shifted its focus to prioritizing the development of the Arctic and the Russian Far East. But let's not forget, Siberia is the heart of Russia, its resource base and its potential. How logical does such a decision seem to you? This declaration was quickly followed by concrete actions with strategic consequences for the country. For instance, in April 2024, Norilsk Nickel, a giant of Russian industry and the world's largest producer of nickel and palladium, announced the closure of its copper plant in Siberia and its relocation to China. This seems rather paradoxical, especially considering that just a year earlier, in 2023, One of the key shareholders of the same company spoke about the possibility of relocating Russia's capital from Moscow to Siberia. Quite the contrast, isn't it? More recently, it became known that the founder of Rusal, one of the world's largest producers of primary aluminum, has been negotiating with Central Asian republics and Abkhazia to establish a large mining pool. Initially, this project was intended for Siberia. These and other developments clearly indicate a retreat from Siberia. Moreover, this very year, reports of the change in strategy began to appear widely in various Russian media outlets. At the same time, the media started promoting the idea that the Russian government now plans to transform the Arctic into the world's largest special economic zone. Now let me ask you this. What do you think prompted them to abandon the development of Siberia so suddenly? I remind you that this program was meticulously crafted by top specialists for over 10 years. It was a large-scale, long-term project in which vast resources and high hopes had been invested. And then, an abrupt U-turn. Why replace it with a new strategy that, according to some Russian economists and analysts, resembles a poorly written student paper submitted at the last minute, rather than a serious development plan for the strategically vital region? What compelled them to change their plans so hastily? The answer is simple. They have realized the reality of the threat posed by the Siberian magma plume. The magma plume is now rising directly beneath the very territory targeted by the previously approved development strategy, which they are now abandoning. As early as 2014, the closed section of ALLATRA's climate report contained facts about the danger of the Siberian plume, and this information was communicated to Russian officials. Beginning in 2021, we, together with ALLATRA volunteers, started publicly warning about the threat of the Siberian plume. It's clear that Russian authorities conducted their own calculations, which confirmed the conclusions that ALLATRA specialists had warned them about back in 2014. That became the turning point. They can deny it all they want, but their actions speak louder than words. They are like rats fleeing from a sinking ship. They are abandoning Siberia and its people, shutting down and relocating multi-billion-dollar projects, hoping to safeguard their assets and wealth in the farthest corners of the country or even abroad, as far away from Siberia as possible. But you know what's most frightening? The people of Russia remain unaware of the actual risk involved. Instead of honestly addressing the issue, the authorities resort to propaganda. They claim that Siberia is a region with no prospects, yet they still expect people to live and work there. Why, you ask? Because for now, they can still extract resources from Siberia and line their own pockets. Rather than addressing the problem and implementing controlled degassing measures, they are shifting their capital and investments to the country's periphery. Do you now see why the new development plan focuses so heavily on the Russian Far East and the Arctic? Now I will address all those involved in this criminal decision. We understand your logic. You're counting on a gradual eruption of the Siberian plume, similar to what happened 250 million years ago. You hope it will slowly spread across the territory without reaching the peripheral areas where you're fleeing with your capital. But in your calculations, you've overlooked a crucial factor. After the last eruption, the structure of the tectonic plate changed dramatically. I've mentioned this before, but I will emphasize it once again. The previous eruptions 250 million years ago penetrated the entire plate, solidifying it with Siberian traps. As a result, The structure of the East Siberian craton became monolithic and robust due to the hardened magma. Thus, there are now two possible scenarios. In addition to the gradual eruption and slow destruction of the region, there is a second, far more dangerous scenario: a massive explosion. The probability that the plate will reach its stress limit and explode instantaneously stands at 55%. You are well aware of this scenario, as your calculations, as we have come to understand, align with ours. Survival of the country's periphery, which you are banking on, is impossible, even in the case of a gradual eruption. It is essential to grasp that even with a slow magma outpour, the Earth's biosphere will undergo global degradation. This process may unfold gradually, but its consequences will inevitably lead to the mass extinction of all life on the planet. The most likely scenario is a sudden breakthrough of the magma plume through the Earth's crust, triggering an immediate and catastrophic eruption. It is estimated that during such an eruption of the Siberian plume, the lethal ash fallout rendering the air unbreathable would cover half the entire planet. This would doom all of us, all of humanity, to extinction. Is there a third scenario? Yes. There is controlled degassing. This is the only way to significantly reduce the risk and save lives. Of course, degassing does not eliminate all dangers. The worst-case scenario during controlled degassing would be a loss of control over the process, which could result in fractures and the gradual release of magma. But even in that case, the consequences would be incomparable to the catastrophic scenarios I just described. From the very first stages of degassing, the pressure within the magma plume would begin to decrease, eliminating the possibility of an explosive eruption. Even if the process spirals out of control, it would result in a slow, manageable release of magma, not an instantaneous disaster. The worst-case scenario of degassing is still far better than either of the catastrophic outcomes previously mentioned. Yes, Siberia would suffer, but the periphery of Russia would remain untouched. Even in the most unfavorable situation, only 30% of the country would be affected. If the process goes smoothly, the affected area would shrink to just about 5 to 7%, or at most 10%. Controlled degassing minimizes damage to humanity and offers a real chance to preserve life on Earth. You likely wonder why the Russian government refuses to pursue controlled degassing if it's a viable solution to eliminating the threat. The answer, sadly, is simple: self-interest. Controlled degassing would require the evacuation of millions of people from the danger zone, which in turn would halt the daily profits these territories generate for the authorities. For them, this means massive financial losses. The catastrophe hasn't happened yet, but they would already have to take a financial hit. Would they agree to that? Of course not. Personal profit triumphs over common sense. They wouldn't warn the public and will continue spreading disinformation for as long as possible. Even now, they've begun claiming that Siberia's wealth is insignificant, insisting that the periphery, such as the Arctic, is far more promising. But this is pure hypocrisy. Siberia has always been Russia's pride and resource base, the foundation that made the country wealthy and turned it into a global geopolitical player. And now they are abandoning it, declaring that Siberia is no longer of interest. But rejecting Siberia also means rejecting degassing. For them, personal profit is far more important than their citizens, more important than the people of the world, and more important than the future of humanity. Now I will again address the Russian authorities. Are you truly prepared to play this deadly game of Russian roulette? Are you ready to gamble with the life of the entire planet just because you refuse to carry out controlled degassing, a process that could neutralize this global threat? Are we all supposed to die because of your incompetence? Everything you do makes it clear that the decision has already been made. You have no intention of pursuing controlled degassing. If you were serious about it, you would have engaged a broad range of specialists, including international experts with experience in controlled degassing. But you have done no such thing. Instead, you've chosen a path of silence, suppression of the truth, and denial of the threat. If there were no threat, any reasonable government in your position would invite an international commission to prove it. But what do we see? Not only does Russia refuse to invite international experts, but it actively withdrawing its assets from Siberia. That speaks volumes. All your actions, both those I've mentioned and those that remain behind the scenes, indicate that your calculations regarding Siberia match ours. You are well aware that the threat is real and inevitable. If everything were fine with Siberia, why would you abandon it at such a tremendous financial loss to yourselves? The fact that you acted against your own economic interests can only mean one thing. You have already accepted the negative scenarios regarding the Siberian magma plume as inevitable. Instead of taking decisive action to prevent a catastrophe and protect the lives of your citizens, you have chosen a different path. You have started revising the country's development strategy, blocking information channels, and silencing everyone who tried to reveal the truth, including Alatra volunteers, not only in Russia, but also in Ukraine. Notice the timing. In January 2023, when it became clear that your own calculations aligned with ours, you made the decision to abandon Siberia. That same year, instead of showing gratitude to our scientists and Alatra volunteers, you began a harsh crackdown on them. Why? To prevent people from learning the truth and to avoid mass panic in Russia. To ensure that the world never finds out. The persecution of Alatra volunteers intensified both in Russia and in Ukraine. It was FSB agents who orchestrated the persecution of Alatra volunteers in Ukraine, involving even Ukrainian security services. Rather than acting according to the law, those services began pursuing an American organization. This raises an obvious question. Where did the American taxpayers' money go all these years if Ukraine's security service ultimately followed orders from Russia's FSB? In the Kremlin, you are terrified that the truth about the Siberian magma plume will become public knowledge. Your policy of total control and suppression of the truth continues to intensify, steadily expanding into new areas, from the international information space to the domestic scientific community. In Russia, the FSB already controls the scientist. The new law requiring Russian scientists to obtain FSB approval for any new collaboration with foreign colleagues is clear proof of this very statement. This is no longer just censorship. It's a blatant admission of your vested interest in concealing the real threat. This is not simply irresponsible, it is criminal. First and foremost, toward your own citizens whom you are deceiving. Look at the screen right in front of you. You will see the names of Russian cities that will be completely destroyed within the first minutes and hours in the event of a Siberian plume explosion. Among them are major cities, Krasnoyarsk, Tomsk, Surgut, and Norilsk. These are cities from which you, the Russian authorities, have been generously extracting income from, at the expense of your own people. You lie to these people. You tell them there is no threat to their lives and instruct them not to worry, to raise their children properly, and to have more. You are knowingly condemning them to a torturous death. Millions of lives, entire cities, and entire regions. You are sacrificing all this just to preserve your power and wealth. Do you think we don't see this? We see everything. Every step you take, every silent decision, everything points to one conclusion. Human life means literally nothing to you. Now I will tell you something else, something you apparently don't know. You couldn't have foreseen it or calculated it due to your lack of information and professional competence. Even without the threat of the Siberian plume, we are facing yet another danger of equal magnitude. This is a threat we created ourselves, one from which there is no escape. I am talking about micro and nanoplastics, which have already infiltrated every corner of our planet. They are in the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food we eat. Nanoplastics are not merely pollutants. They are an anthropogenic factor that is already affecting our health and our future. Research shows that their accumulation in the human body is directly linked to the rising number of children born with autism. If we do nothing about this, in just a few generations, every second child in the world could be born with an autism spectrum disorder. This is not a forecast. It is the reality we must confront. Moreover, micro and nanoplastics disrupt the water balance, further heating the already dying ocean. As a result, the ocean, instead of producing oxygen, begins to emit CO2. These emissions have already destabilized the water balance in the atmosphere, and this process will only intensify. The disruption of water exchange will inevitably lead to a breakdown in gas exchange, causing a gradual depletion of oxygen. This will trigger irreversible processes of human degradation. Scientific evidence confirms a direct link between CO2 concentration and developmental disorders. Oxygen deficiency and increased acidity in the body provoke neurodegenerative processes. The mechanism is quite simple. Rising CO2 levels directly affect cognitive abilities, effectively programming the degradation of humans as a biological species. Projections suggest that within a few short generations, up to 90% of the entire population could suffer from severe neurological disorders. This problem will have to be addressed. There is no escaping it. It concerns every person on this planet. It concerns our children and our grandchildren. A complete ban on plastic is currently unrealistic due to its widespread use in various aspects of our lives. The primary challenge is not to prohibit plastic entirely, but to create an economically viable model for its disposal. Without this, the only macroeconomic benefit left will be the gradual degradation and extinction of humanity. Now imagine adding a catastrophic eruption of the Siberian magma plume to everything else that is already happening. Uncontrolled CO2 saturation of the atmosphere, nanoplastic pollution, and natural disasters. Even if the plume doesn't explode instantaneously and instead erupts gradually, the consequences of releasing such a massive volume of lava will continue to grow and worsen. Even if life on the periphery of Russia temporarily survives, after Siberia ceases to exist, life for the survivors will become a living hell. The colossal lava eruptions will oversaturate the atmosphere with carbon dioxide, delivering a catastrophic blow to the Earth's biosphere. Instead of a gradual reduction in pressure within the magma plume, as would occur during controlled degassing, the lava will erupt across a broad front, burying vast areas of Siberia under tons of lava flows and ash layers, just as it did 250 million years ago during the formation of the Siberian traps. The release of ash and gases will push humanity to the brink of extinction, just as it happened during the Great Permian extinction, when 90% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial species perished. Even a slight increase in CO2 saturation from plants and oceans already impacts humans' health and accelerates ecosystem collapse. With the additional heat energy pouring into the atmosphere, combined with ash and aerosol emissions, the results will be catastrophic. Will life survive on Earth? Considering the existing problems, plastic pollution, and a dying ocean, our extinction becomes inevitable. If the Siberian plume erupts in a sudden explosion, it will be too late to evacuate from Siberia. Those caught in the affected zone will die instantly. Humanity will not survive. At that point, at least plastic will no longer be a concern. It will be incinerated along with us. But there is another way: controlled degassing. If paired with ocean cleanup efforts, this process could save our world. However, Russian media features comments from so-called specialists who claim there is no threat from the Siberian plume because, allegedly, plumes move slowly, rising at just 4 centimeters per year. I hate to disappoint you, colleagues, but your calculations on the speed of magma plume ascent are based solely on theoretical models and observations of modern stable plume structures. Where did the concept even come from that plumes supposedly rise only a few centimeters per year? You rely solely on the layers of solidified lava from past eruptions, but that provides no basis for determining how quickly the magma plume actually moved within the mantle. You have no idea how fast plumes rise when they are first forming. And more importantly, the Earth has never before experienced a simultaneous ascent of a mantle plume and an increase in intermantle eruptions. We are currently in extraordinary conditions that Earth's geological history has never encountered before. Take a look at your own seismic tomography. Melted material at the core, known as LLSVP zones, is expanding right before your eyes. Let me explain precisely what LLSVP zones are. These are massive regions of molten material at the Earth's core that are detected because seismic waves travel through them more slowly than through the rest of the mantle. You must understand that the size of these zones was underestimated in previous calculations. In reality, their growth indicates that mantle melting is progressing at an inexorable pace. This incredibly rapid mantle melting, by geological standards, is precisely why the Siberian plume has risen from the depths within just a few decades, contrary to your theoretical calculations. Accelerated mantle melting is accompanied by intermantle explosions, which you detect as deep focus earthquakes. These earthquakes are not limited to subduction zones along plate boundaries, but also occur far from these regions. Just calculate how powerful these intermantle explosions must be to occur under the immense pressure of mantle layers 500 to 600 kilometers or 310 to 370 miles thick. The number of these intermantle explosions is growing exponentially due to mantle heating from the core and the ocean's diminished capacity to dissipate heat from the lithospheric plates. Within just 6 years, the number of deep focus earthquakes could abruptly stop when the mantle material fully melts. Once that happens, we will witness unprecedented geological processes, namely the sudden and rapid movement of continents. The fragile crust, the Earth's outer shell, will begin sliding over the asthenosphere faster than anyone could have ever imagined. And you know full well what this movement of tectonic plates will bring: mega earthquakes. Now coming back to the speed of magma plume ascent. It has already reached the Earth's crust and is rapidly melting through it beneath a vast territory, striving to break through to the surface. To give you an idea of how quickly magma can melt through the crust, let me provide a well-known example. In our modern history, we have seen cases where magma burned its way through the crust in a matter of months. Recall the Bransfield Strait incident in 2020 to 2021. In just 6 months, active magma burned through 10 kilometers, that is to say 6 miles, of the Earth's 15-kilometer thick, 9-mile thick crust. During that time, the magma's rise was accompanied by 85,000 earthquakes. Within 6 months, only 5 kilometers, 3 miles, remained before it could break through the seafloor. The deep mantle, with its extreme temperatures, expands in volume, increasing its pressure on the Earth's crust. Now consider the immense pressure currently being exerted on the tectonic structures of western and eastern Siberia. Seismic activity along the edges of these structures continues to grow, a clear indicator of the tremendous forces at work. As for the claims that the plume should be visible on seismic tomography models under Siberia, well, you know perfectly well, colleagues, that you don't have enough data to assemble a reliable seismic tomography image for this region. Or are you deliberately lying in your articles? Not to mention that you rely on data collected over 30 or more years, which produces a distorted picture, kind of like a chupacabra, rather than an accurate representation of what's actually happening. Allow me to give you an analogy. It's as if you put a child into an MRI scanner. Instead of doing a quick scan, you leave them there for 30 years until they grow into an adult. Then you take all those images and average them out. What you end up with is a Frankenstein-like result, just like your seismic models, which entirely fail to reflect the rapid changes in growth of the Siberian plume's head over the past 30 years. Stop wasting time with nonsense. Some Russian journalists claim that I rely on so-called incompetent sources. However, in one of my previous addresses, I specifically cited scientific papers written by Russian scientists. So what's your problem, journalist? Do you consider your own Russian scientists and their official research incompetent? Or is the real problem that only the FSB decides who is competent, ignoring science, common sense, and the safety of its own population? I neither expect nor seek official confirmations or denials of my statements. Any official statement, even a denial of the truth I'm presenting, will only draw more attention to this information. Eventually, Russian citizens will connect the dots and realize that I am telling the absolute truth, not their government. For the Russian authorities, that is unacceptable. If the Russian people knew the full extent of the situation, if they knew what their leadership knew, not a single person would remain in Siberia. Alatra volunteers and I are often asked, what is it like to live knowing all this information? Especially when the events we've warned about begin to unfold in reality. In the past, we tried to explain it in words, but now you will have the opportunity to quite literally understand it for yourselves. When you see it with your own eyes, you will feel for yourself what it's like to live with such knowledge. 30 years ago, we, the scientists of Alatra, took on the responsibility of uncovering the causes of global climate and geodynamic changes. We conducted extensive interdisciplinary research, established cause and effect relationships, and pointed to a potential solution. However, Alatra volunteers took it upon themselves to spread this knowledge to the world. I joined them in this mission. However, we never claimed the responsibility for stopping the climate collapse. We are not the ones who will solve this problem. We are the ones who diagnosed it and offered a solution, like a doctor who informs a patient of a serious illness and shows the path to recovery. We cannot resolve geopolitical and macroeconomic issues, so do not shift the responsibility for implementing solutions onto us. That is beyond our capacity and not our mission. Our mission is both simple and challenging at the same time: to deliver the truth to people. Yes, it is hard, but we Alatra volunteers did not choose an easy path. We chose an honest one. We knew that telling the truth would come at a high price, and we are paying it. In Russia, Alatra volunteers are already in prison. In Ukraine, volunteers face criminal persecution at the hands of FSB agents and their accomplices. Their goal is to silence us. But silencing us will not save Siberian cities or protect millions of Russian citizens. As long as the threat of a Siberian plume eruption remains unaddressed, the world is doomed. This statement is not a metaphor. It is a scientific fact. Friends, facts do not become any less real simply because you refuse to acknowledge them. When the Siberian plume erupts uncontrollably, whether explosively or gradually, it will trigger a global population migration. Half of the world's inhabitants will move as far from Siberia as possible, fleeing to other continents. This horrific process is becoming nearly inevitable due to the Russian authorities' refusal to implement controlled degassing. However, what Russian authorities fear even more than global migration is internal migration. They dread the possibility that information about the Siberian plume will reach the public. Any rational person in Russia, upon learning the truth, will do everything in their power to leave the country. Even the most oblivious individual would rather walk away from Siberia on foot than stay there. The Russian authorities understand that if such an exodus begins, it will result in a massive outflow of capital from their territory, and most importantly, a loss of personal income, something they fear more than the inevitable death of millions of people. They will do whatever it takes to prevent that. The loss of personal wealth is a far greater catastrophe for the Russian authorities than the looming extinction of their citizens. But life is worth fighting for.